This is the Grottol from Mowzie's Mobs, and for the past 8 years, he's had to keep his love for K-pop a secret. This crystal crustacean will play a little jingle and turn pink if it travels along rails on a certain pattern, but the reason this pattern hasn't been found since its creation in 2015 is because it looks like this. Let me explain. If you don't know, Mowzie's Mobs is a Java and Bedrock mod that adds super polished and high quality mobs and bosses to the game. Some of these mobs have their own Easter eggs, which takes us to the Grottol. As I was doing research for my most recent video, I stumbled across this message from the Mowzie's Mobs Discord from the creator himself saying the hidden music track was an Easter egg made by another contributor, Paul Fulham, and Mowzie didn't know how to trigger it. Being a programmer myself, I hopped over to the mod's code on GitHub and was greeted with this. I'd expected to find a hard-coded set of directions that spelled out the pattern, but instead saw 6 unexplained numbers and a big if statement with some bitmath sprinkled in. Don't worry, we'll get to this. All I knew was that this section encoded a pattern somehow, so I figured I'd just throw it to ChatGPT so it could write me a solver as I worked on the rest of the script for the mod showcase video. I let it run in the background while I finished the video, and when I came back a few days later to check the progress, it was only 30% done? At this rate, it would take months to find a solution. It was time to revisit the code and take matters into my own hands. Don't worry if you're unfamiliar with code, I'll break it down. But first, I'm very excited to say I'm now a Nord affiliate. Use my links in the description to save 75% off NordPass and NordVPN. Firstly, these long strings of random letters are actually numbers in the hexadecimal, or base 16, format. Normally, we think of numbers going from 0 to 9 before going to double digits. This is called decimal format. In base 16, we have our regular 0 through 9, and then we also have A through F, which represent 10 through 15. The 0x in front of the numbers tell the code that we're using the hexadecimal format, and the L at the end means they are long numbers that take up 64 bits, which we'll get back to in a moment. Looking at the code, we have 4 main components: a list of hex numbers called mask, a single hex number called test, a single hex number called state, and a method called apply that tells us if we have found the pattern and triggers the Easter egg. Looking first into the apply method, we get the ordinal with this big math equation, which I just assumed told you what cardinal direction, north, south, east, or west, the track needed to go at a specific point. Next, we'll check if the Easter egg should play. The first part of this simply makes sure the ordinal falls within the range 0 through 3, which again corresponds to the direction the minecart is traveling. No problems there. The next part makes sure that the current direction the minecart is going is different from the direction it was going the previous tick, where ticks are Minecraft's way of representing time, and each one is 1/20th of a second, unless the previous direction was the ordinal 1. This means that the minecart is allowed to travel in one certain direction indefinitely without messing up the pattern. Keep this in mind for later. Finally, we have the last part of the check, which does some math on the state and test variables. Now, it's time to talk about binary. But don't worry, binary is just another number system, just like what we've already covered. Where decimal goes from 0 through 9, and hexadecimal goes from 0 to 15, binary goes from 0 to 1 and is the language computers speak. All a binary number is a string of 1s and 0s. So, for example, the first hexadecimal number in the mask looks like this in binary. This is the key to... Now that we know what binary is, we can return to the last part of the if statement, working from the inside out. Mask ordinal simply tells us which entry in the mask list to look at. For instance, if ordinal was equal to 0, we'd look at the first entry in the list, and if it was equal to 2, we'd look at the third item in the list. Next, this vertical bar tells us to OR the selected item from the mask with the current value of the state variable. This is a mathematical operation that can be solved with simple algebra. Firstly, we'll represent the state variable in binary. Next, we put the currently selected mask underneath the state variable, also in binary. Then we go from right to left, moving column by column. An OR means that if there is a 1 in any column, the result is 1, and otherwise, if both columns are 0, the answer is 0. Let's test this out with an example, laying the state variable out in binary, and let's choose the first item in the mask list to OR with beneath it. Starting from right to left, we see a 0 in the state variable and a 1 in the mask, so since there's at least 1 1 in the equation, the answer is 1 in that slot. Next, since there's a 1 in the state variable, the answer is 1. After repeating that process, this is the string we end up with. The next part of the equation has these 2 left arrows followed by a 1. this represents a bit shift by one position to the left. This does exactly what it sounds like. It moves all bits one column to the left. The leftmost bit falls off, and we add a 0 to the rightmost bit as a filler. Finally, we perform an AND with the test variable. An AND is similar to an OR operation, but instead of needing at least one 1 in any column to give us a 1 in the result, we need both items in the column to be equal to 1. Otherwise, if there's any zeros at all, the answer is 0. If the AND operation returns 0, we trigger the Easter egg. Looking at the test variable in binary, we see that it's already almost all zeros with a single 1 in the 52nd position. Looking at the state variable, we see that it's all 1s except for a 0 in the first position. Performing this AND operation with these variables will not equal 0. We need to find some way to line up the 0 at the rightmost position in the state variable with the 0 at the 52nd position in the test variable. Luckily, we do have a way to move the 0 over with the bit shift we talked about earlier. This is it. This is how we find what pattern the Grottol needs to ride in to satisfy the condition and unlock its true love of Blackpink. First, let's lay out all the mask numbers in binary and then put the state variable below it. If we look at the columns of the masks, we can see that in any given column, there's only ever 1 0. We now know we need to move the 0 in the state variable 52 positions to the left to line up with the test variable. The 0 in the state variable gets shifted when we successfully OR the state variable with one of the masks, and an OR operation results in a 0 only when both operands are 0. Therefore, to determine the correct order to move, we can look at the column where the state's 0 currently is, find the mask with a 0 in the corresponding column, and write that down as the current step. To make this process easier, I wrote a simple program in Python that laid out all the information, allowed me to press a key to simulate a step in a direction, kept track of my inputs so I could save the pattern for later, and checked if I had found the correct pattern. After moving the 0 all the way over, I had the answer. This pattern should trigger the Grottol to change colors and play the K-pop jingle. Now, to build it in-game. To build a track, we first need to ensure we know what direction corresponds to which mask. When I built a simple square and put the Grottol in it while printing out the direction values, I expected to see a different number for each cardinal direction, but instead I only saw 2 numbers. One on the straightaways and a different one on the corners. Clearly, I had to inspect the getOrdinal function more closely. Writing out the function in mathematical symbols, we get the following, which I then recognize as the common formula for, just kidding, I asked ChatGPT. It turns out the function returns an ordinal based on the relative movement of the minecart on the current frame compared to the previous frame. In other words, it tells us the change in direction of the minecart. If the minecart is going straight, its value is 1. If it's turning clockwise, its value is 2, and if it's counterclockwise, the value is 0. We'll get back to what a value of 3 means, but leave a comment if you think you can guess it. Armed with this new information, I began building the track. We'll start with some tracks going straight, then we get a left turn, then straight again, then another left, and we've hit a dead end. Now, some sharp viewers may remember earlier in the video when I said, the next part makes sure that the current direction the minecart is going is different from the direction it was going the previous tick, unless the previous direction was the ordinal 1. This means that the minecart is allowed to travel in one certain direction indefinitely without messing up the pattern. Keep this in mind for later. Which means we can go straight as long as we want and keep turning inwards. If you didn't remember this, then don't worry, neither did I. Instead, I turned to the third dimension, and whenever the track would hit itself, I instead went underneath it. I used trapdoors to give the Grottol enough clearance to go under the track. Did you know you could do this? But was succeeding in building the pattern. I was about halfway done with the build by the time I reached my first 3 in the code. If you haven't left your guess in the comments as to what direction it is, do it now, because a 3 represents going backwards. My first idea as to how to accomplish reversing direction on a minecart was to send the Grottol off of a drop and land on a rail going the opposite way, but whenever I tried to get the Grottol to fall off, it simply dismounted the minecart, meaning the solution wouldn't work. Another way to reverse direction is to collide with a block or entity on a powered rail. This works to send the minecart backwards, but doesn't work to trigger the Easter egg because the pattern doesn't repeat after hitting the reversed instruction. The minecart needs to continue on a different path after the reverse. I then tried to use a detector rail to switch the Grottol onto a different track, but due to some strange collision, the minecart would hit the block in reverse direction before the red sun signal could switch the track direction. This would probably work if I remembered you could go straight indefinitely without breaking the pattern, but unfortunately that's not the world we live in. I decided to test if vanilla mobs also dismounted the minecart when going over a gap, but they had no problems with this. It was special behavior with the Grottol exclusively. As a stopgap, I added code to just prevent the Grottol from ever leaving the minecart, which worked. Kind of. The Grottol was able to make the jump, but when it landed, the state variable would reset, starting over from the beginning. At first, I thought this meant that the pattern was wrong, so I wrote another program that would find the pattern automatically, but it gave me the same answer. Going back to the code, I found a check that kicked the Grottol out of the minecart if it was ever not on a rail block. Since being in midair is not the same as being on a rail, the Grottol was getting kicked out during jumps. I modified the existing check to allow for the Grottol to be in midair, and success! The pattern did not restart after the jump, and going backwards was successfully recognized by the code. With all the pieces in place, I finished building the pattern, sent the Grottol along it, and it worked. Well, halfway. It played a sound, but the Grottol doesn't look any different. What gives? If we look at the code that runs when the pattern succeeds, we see the part that plays a sound, which works, but then we see something about changing a block state. While the Grottol may look like a mineral, it's definitely a living creature. It turns out that due to technical limitations in the version of Minecraft the Grottol was added in, Mowzie simulated the Grottol riding the minecart by replacing it with a block during travel. Since this is no longer the case, I modified the code to work with a new way of doing things and ran one last test. And success! The Grottol played the sound and changed colors properly. The Easter egg is fixed. And at the time of upload, I've submitted a merge request to the Mowzie's Mobs GitHub and linked a fork with a fix in the description in the meantime if you want to build it yourself. Thanks for watching. Peace out, everybody.